3 or 4? Yeah, start 3. Okay.
Exile means modest manners, wisdom which remains unknown, prudence not recognized as such by most, the hidden life, an invisible intention, unseen meditation, desire for humiliation, longing for hardship, constant determination to love God, abundance of love, renunciation of vainglory, depth of silence. Those who have come to love the Lord are at first unceasingly and greatly disturbed by this thought, as if burning with divine fire. I speak of separation from their own, undertaken by the lovers of perfection, so that they may live a life of hardship and simplicity. But great and praiseworthy as this is, yet it requires great discretion, for not every kind of exile carried to extremes is good. If every prophet goes unhonored in his own country, as the Lord says, then let us beware lest our exile should be for us an occasion of vainglory. For exile is separation from everything in order to keep the mind inseparable from God. Exile loves and produces continual weeping. An exile is a fugitive from every relationship with his own people and with strangers.
Okay.
And then,
And I'm going to stop you after a couple paragraphs and make some comments. There's a very interesting note at the bottom of this edition. It's a double exile or pilgrimage is a double translation for exile or xenitia. Xenos in Greek means stranger. And so xenitia would literally mean living as a stranger. It doesn't necessarily imply that you've left your own land and its people, but that you live as a stranger within it. And it says it might also be translated as unworldliness, which is interesting because what this is doing is it's picking up the theme of detachment from the last chapter. This is one of the manifestations of detachment, that you live as a stranger to family, friends, your own stuff, your own possessions, or what had been your own possessions that you have left for the sake of following Christ. And it is something that's very, very disturbing, because usually the last thing we want to do is leave our families behind and leave everything that's familiar and go and live in a foreign land. To live as a stranger, and specifically not to enter into the life of the foreign land, but to live as a stranger. As it says in chapter 3 here, where exile is separation from everything in order to keep the mind inseparable from God. Exile loves and produces continual weeping, and exile is a fugitive from every relationship with his own people and with strangers. So this is tough, you know. We're not talking about something, you know, going off to a nice cushy life in the monastery where, you know, you're just hanging out with a bunch of your buddies and drinking beer and working on some common projects. And no, you're talking about something very different.
and again, Master, I know this is meant for ascetics and monks and nuns, but for us in the church here, relationships with strangers, somebody walks into the church for the first time, and we greet them and try to get them comfortable in the liturgy and the interactions we have with certain people. Is this saying that
No.
doesn't apply to us?
No. And actually in the monastery too, I mean, the brothers do have warm relations among themselves. Actually though, how this applies to us is, think about when you converted to Orthodoxy. you had to leave behind. You left behind friends. Very often you left behind family who didn't appreciate it or agree with it, and thought you'd lost your mind and gone to join this crazy Russian cult.
It's not just Russian. It's basically everybody I know. Like my best childhood friend, he asked me, "Are you going to be a priest now?" Because I go to church.
Yeah.
We're going to so we have really not enough substance to discuss. We only have memories of joyful time together when we were kids.
Yeah, because there's nothing
there's
left
no
in common.
relationship in a way that everybody else is gone, and I'm not part of that. So I have to, and they're still there to me, and I can't join in on any fun that they're having.
Right.
Because I don't get it anymore. It's
Right.
not appealing to me.
Yeah. So I think for us, this experience is much closer to what it means to convert to Orthodoxy, because in reality, you leave it behind. You leave your old life behind. You leave your old identity behind, and you find a new identity in Christ.
As it says in the gospel, I come not to bring peace but a sword. I will divide, fathers against sons and daughters against mothers, and brother against brother. You basically your families are your worst enemies.
Very often, yeah. Sometimes
But then you also try to evangelize them.
you can.
It's like finding a pearl of great price. And here it is.
And sometimes they'll listen, and sometimes they won't.
Right.
Sometimes they'll listen, sometimes they'll have you crucified.
No, that's extreme.
Sometimes they'll listen.
Not really afraid of the wrongness. I mean, your family would often
We're talking family.
Yeah,
and they turn you in
yeah.
Okay.
for
Sometimes.
being Christian.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay.
Most
Most
Well-
of us don't have families that we gotta worry that they're gonna crucify us. Extended families. There may be some friction, but not that.
Sometimes it can be a slow, subtle crucifixion.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a
Maybe unfortunate.
There's a saying, her name is Stanislav, I think it means Goldie. I forget what the Greek is for that, but she was, I'm sorry, you will be probably familiar with her Greek name. I just can't remember what was gold for.
Chryso?
Saint Chrysople? Maybe? Anyway, she was very pretty, and that happens during the Ottoman rule of Bulgaria. So a local Turk sees her walking around and just grabs her and pulls her into his house, and he tries to convince her, to become a Muslim and marry him, and she refuses. So they start torturing her, and her family comes to, they of course. As any good terrorist, they go bring her family into this and tell you go talk some sense into her, so they still suffer too. So they go and they beg her, please, God will forgive you. Just do whatever it takes to survive. And she told him, I have no parents anymore. You mean nothing to me. Just because they're willing for her to give up Christ, and she was not. And she told them that. She denounced them, and she died without parents, basically.
Yeah. This is also a kind of a continuation of that whole period of martyrdom. Because you have to be willing to go into the exile of death, even for Christ's sake. So, chapter 4.
In hastening to solitude and exile, do not wait for world-loving souls, because the thief comes unexpectedly. In trying to save the careless and indolent along with themselves, many perish with them, because in course of time the soul's fire goes out. As soon as the flame is burning within you, run. for you do not know when it will go out and leave you in darkness. Not all of us are required to save others. The divine apostle says, every one of us shall give account of himself to God. And again he says, thou therefore that teachest another, dost thou not teach thyself? This is like saying, I do not know whether we must teach all others, but we most certainly teach ourselves.
Okay. So this is quite an interesting passage. There's a kind of a rule in monastic life, especially when starting a monastery, that those who you expect to follow you won't, and those who you have no idea will. And some people will make a plan with their buddies to go and join a community, and all the others fall away and just the one goes, and which is hard because you have those bonds of friendship and all of that. And but the universal this is really just quoting a kind of a universal principle of the fathers, that if you feel the call to monastic life, run to it, and don't hesitate, and don't wait, and don't wait for other people to approve it. Don't wait for other people to go with you. Just go. And this is also in the end of that passage. Not all of us are required to save others. Well, that's true. Of course, it also says, the scriptures say that, that if you help to lead somebody, a sinner, to salvation, that it covers a multitude of sins. But not everybody does or can do that. But we most certainly have responsibility to answer for ourselves. And as he says, the divine apostle says, every one of us shall give account of himself to God. And again he says, thou therefore that teachest another, dost thou not teach thyself? This is like saying, I don't know whether we must all teach others, but we most certainly teach ourselves. In other words, if we're talking about going to the monastery and trying to drag others with us, we need to go anyway, period, whether they come or not. Okay.
In going into exile, beware of the demon of drifting and of sensual desire, because exile gives him his opportunity.
Okay. Drifting and sensual desire. Of course, there's nothing more unstable than a young man who's not married. For the most part, right? Sorry, Elijah.
No, I'm just thinking, unstable and stable can be both a good thing and a bad thing.
No, stable is usually a very good thing.
Well,
Stable is.
it depends on the context.
What in this context, stable is a good thing.
For example, for a house, stable is what you want. For a structure that you want to be stable, stable is what you want.
A car that's stable is not a good thing.
Right. Basically, something that is designed for mobility, you don't want it to. You can sometimes want it not to be stable to increase maneuverability.
Right. In this case, what it's talking
is desired.
Yeah. In this case, what it's talking about is that it's very important to avoid the temptation when looking to go into the monastic life to just go around and check out everything and kind of enjoy their hospitality and just kind of drift around. And you can do that. I mean, there's all these books on pilgrimages to Mount Athos, and a lot of them are doing exactly that. They're tourists. And you can always tell the difference, when they come to the monastery, between a tourist and a seeker. And a real seeker will really inquire into the inner life of the community, whereas a tourist, well, they might want to see the buildings, see the chapel, see the library, maybe, whatever. See what kind of food you make. See, check out the goat barn, whatever. Look at the cute little baby goats hopping around. But they're just drifting. Because what it does is it just gratifies the passions. And of course, exile does give one that opportunity to go be a tourist. So,
Detachment is excellent, but her mother is exile. Having become an exile for the Lord's sake, we should have no ties at all, lest we seem to be roving in order to gratify our passions. Have you become an exile from the world? Do not touch the world anymore, because the passions desire nothing better than to return. Eve was exiled from paradise against her will, but the monk is a willing exile from his home. She would have liked the tree of disobedience again, and he would certainly expose himself daily to frequent danger from relatives according to the flesh. Run from places of sin as from the plague, for when fruit is not present, we have no frequent desire to eat it.
Yeah, this is another basic principle of spiritual life. You don't expose yourself to situations of temptation. You turn away from it, and you run, and literally, if necessary, run away.
Joseph was a good example.
Yeah.
That was like in Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
It's the perfect example of what to do when faced with temptation.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, if you've gone on a trip, instead of going into exile, if you've just gone on a trip, you're just drifting around, checking out everything, and how easy it is to fall into all sorts of temptations. So,
What do you got?
mhm.
8.
Mhm.
8 was exile. 6. Detachment is excellent, but her mother is exile. Why her? Is there any reason they use the feminine there?
Mhm. Well, probably the word in Greek is
Okay.
feminine. Most languages have genders, which have nothing to do with sex, but how is detachment? But it's just the xenitia would be xenitia would be feminine as well. Do you have a question?
No,
Comment? Okay.
just our modern society is confusing gender and sex.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Very confusing. Very confused. So Eve was exiled from paradise against her will, but the monk is a willing exile from his home. She, that is Eve, would have liked the tree of disobedience again, and he, that is the monk, would certainly expose himself daily to frequent danger from relatives according to the flesh. In other words, we like to be home with mom. That's the problem. Okay. So Moses, you want to pick up 10?
Be on the lookout for this trick and wile of the thieves, for they suggest to us that we need not separate ourselves from people in the world, and maintain that we shall receive a great reward if we can look upon women and still remain continent. We must not believe these suggestions, but rather the opposite. When we have lived a year or two away from our family, and have acquired some piety and contrition and continence, then vain thoughts begin to rise up in us and urge us to go again to our homeland, for the edification of many, they say, and as an example and for the profit of those who seek our former life's life. And if we possess the gift of eloquence and some sheds of knowledge, the thoughts occur to us that we could be saviors of souls and teachers in the world, that we may waste in the sea what we have gathered so well in the harbor. Let us try to imitate not Lot's wife, but Lot himself. For when a soul turns back to what it is left, like salt, it loses its savor and becomes henceforth useless. Run from Egypt without looking back, because the hearts which look back upon it with affection shall not see Jerusalem, the land of dispassion. Those who left their own people in childlike simplicity at the beginning, and have since been completely purified, may profitably return to their former land, perhaps even with the intention, after saving themselves, of saving others too. Yet Moses, who was allowed to see God himself and was sent by God for the salvation of his own people, met many dangers in Egypt, that is to say, dark periods in the world.
No. It is better to grieve our parents than the Lord, for he has created and saved us, but they have often ruined their loved ones and delivered them up to their doom. He is an exile who, having knowledge, sits like one of foreign speech amongst people of another tongue. It is not from hatred that we separate ourselves from our own people or places, God forbid, but to avoid the harm which might come to us from them. In this, as in everything else, it is Christ who teaches us what is good for us. For it is clear that he often left his parents according to the flesh. And when he was told, "Thy mother and thy brethren are seeking for thee," our good Lord and Master at once showed us an example of dispassionate hatred when he said, "My mother and my brethren are they who do the will of my Father who is in heaven."
So this is important. There are two versions of the passage. If you love father or mother more than me, you are not worthy of me. There's also another version of it in another gospel. Unless you hate father, mother, brother, sister, wife, children, lands, you're not worthy of me. And what it's not talking about, some kind of passionate emotional hatred. What it's talking about is detachment. It's detachment.
Is that what dispassionate hatred means?
Yeah. It's not that you're not willing to let them hold you back from, in this case, going off into the monastic life, but in our case, of coming to Christ, because really, the monastic journey is in a sense just another aspect for people in a different stage of life of coming to Christ. Remember, in the early church, while they did have infant baptism, most people converted as adults and had to leave behind, and it was not politically correct in the early church to become a Christian in the first 300 years. And, so the Christians were subject to great persecutions, and so I can only imagine the kinds of family fights that would happen when one of the members of the family all of a sudden decides, to take the idols, the family idols, and smash them, and goes off and becomes a Christian.
We see the same thing today among Orthodox.
Yep.
When a son or daughter decides to go to the monastery.
Oh, yeah. But you also see the same thing today when, in a Protestant or Catholic family, when a son or daughter or somebody decides to become Orthodox. And they get all sorts of flack. And that's hard. It's hard, My family almost disowned me, quite frankly, Didn't last very long. But I think with me, they finally decided that I wasn't going through a phase by the time I was ordained, which was what, 14 years later. So, anyway. In other words, this dispassionate hatred, this it's not hatred in the sense of despising. It's a not willing to let ourselves be held back. It's 14. It's not from hatred that we separate ourselves from our own people or places, God forbid, but to avoid the harm which might come to us from them. In this, as in everything else, it is Christ who teaches us what is good for us. For it is clear that he often left his parents according to the flesh, and when he was told, "Thy mother and brethren are seeking for thee," our good Lord and Master once showed us an example of that dispassionate hatred when he said, "My mother and my brethren are they who do the will of my Father who is in heaven." Now, of course, he also extols his mother as one who heard the word of God and did it. So,
When it says those who have been completely purified may return to their former land, perhaps even with the intention, after saving themselves, of saving others too, who would that be in this modern age?
that would be somebody who's been in the monastic life for many years and has attained to a great degree of maturity.
Would they then be a priest?
Most likely, yeah. But, some kid who comes and joins the monastery at 23 or 25 or whatever and is in there for 2 years and gains, what does he say? If he's eloquent and has some shred of knowledge. In other words, he knows enough to be dangerous. And he goes back and, he's all confident in himself. He's preaching and teaching. He's going to be the new Moses, and ends up running off with his old girlfriend or something like that. And this is, there are centuries and centuries and centuries of tradition that bear this up. So. So it's really only those who are mature, really spiritually mature, really committed to the monastic way, really completely committed to it, not just as to monasticism, but as to Christ.
So many of the mature elders like that went and tried to live by themselves, and God wouldn't let them.
That's right.
He'd bring people to them,
Mm-hmm.
to their chagrin many times, but that's kind of like this too.
Yeah.
You weren't seeking it, but
Right.
God directed.
Yeah, exactly. I'm in the midst of reading, I just finished today, a book which I absolutely recommend. The Guru, the Young Men, and Elder Paisios.
I read that.
What an incredible book. And well worth reading. And it's so funny because this kid, here he goes to Elder Paisios. He's having trouble. He's kind of this dabbling in Eastern religions, starts having demonic experiences, goes to Elder, experiences it. The Elder loves him, cleans it all up, banishes the evil one, gives him a gift of grace. And what does he do? He goes running off to India to a guru, where he gets really demonized. And then here he is sitting in this Indian ashram, with all of these people, chanting invocations to demons, saying the Jesus prayer. And not only, and getting all sorts of major resistance, which of course he'd be getting major resistance, but but in the process, he virtually got possessed and had horrific demonic attacks, and he just can't shake, and he just couldn't shake it, because he loves the elder, and he would go and live as a novice, and then he'd go off and run off to some guru or something like that, and there was some woman guru he went off and ran after for a while, and I don't know. but the book is really good, and it also shows the fickleness of youth. So, chapter 15.
Let him be your father, who is able and willing to labor with you in bearing the burden of your sins, and your mother, contrition, which can cleanse you from impurity, and your brother, your comrade, who toils and fights side by side with you in your striving toward the heights. Acquire an inseparable wife, the remembrance of death, and let your beloved children be the size of your heart. Make your body your slave, and your friends the holy powers, angels, who can help you at the hour of your death, if they become your friends. This is the generation of them that seek the Lord. Longing for God extinguishes longing for our parents, and so anyone who says he has both is deceiving himself. He should listen to him who says, no one can serve two lords. I have not come, says the Lord, to bring peace on earth, that is, love of parents for sons, and love of brothers for brothers who have resolved to serve me, but war and a sword, in order to separate lovers of God from lovers of the world, the lovers of material things from lovers of spiritual things, the lovers of fame from the humble-minded. For strife and separation delight the Lord when they spring from love for himself. Look, beware, lest you who cherish attachment to kinsmen be exposed to the all-engulfing deluge, and you be swept away by the cataclysm of love for the world. Do not be moved by the tears of parents or friends, otherwise you will be weeping eternally. When they surround you like bees, or rather wasps, and shed tears over you, do not for one moment hesitate, but sternly fix the eye of your soul on your past actions and your death. You may ward off one sorrow by another. Our own, or more correctly, those who are not our own, flatteringly promise to do everything to please us, but their aim is to hinder our spiritual course, and then in this way drag us to their own goal. For our solitary life, let us choose places where there are fewer opportunities for comfort and ambition, but more for humility. Otherwise we shall be fleeing in company with our passions. Hide your noble birth and do not glory in your distinction, lest you be found to be one thing in word and another in deed. No one has surrendered himself to exile to such an extent as that great man, speaking of Abraham, who heard, "Go forth out of thy land and out of thy kindred and out of the house of thy father." And then he was called into a barbarous land that spake another tongue. Sometimes the Lord has brought more glory to the man who has gone into exile after the manner of this great patriarch, but even if glory is God-given, yet it is excellent to divert it from oneself with the shield of humility. When men or demons praise us for our exile, as for some great exploit or achievement, then let us think of him who for our sake was exiled from heaven to earth, and we shall find that throughout all eternity it is impossible for us to make return for this. Attachment either to some particular relative or to strangers is dangerous. Little by little, it can entice us back to the world and completely quench the fire of our compunction. It is impossible to look at the sky with one eye and at the earth with the other, and it is equally impossible for anyone not to expose his soul to danger who has not separated himself completely, both in thought and body, from his own relatives and from others. By much labor and effort, a good and stable character is developed in us. But what is achieved with great labor can be lost in a single moment. For evil conversation corrupteth good habits, being at once worldly and disorderly. The man who associates with people of the world or approaches them after his renunciation will certainly either fall into their traps or will defile his heart by thinking about them, or if he is not defiled himself, yet by condemning those who are defiled, he himself will be defiled.
Okay. There's a whole lot here. So, with 22 in particular, when men or demons praise us for our exile, we have to remember that there's always the possibility of demonic temptation, and that it's something very, very real. And this is, and the deeper you get into the spiritual life, the more real it becomes. It's not just a figment of our imagination. You know, there are demons, and they do try and tempt us. Though sometimes they don't have to work very hard. In fact, sometimes they don't have to work at all, because we not only tempt ourselves, but we tempt each other. And so it's we have to be very careful not to do that. And so if we start to have vainglorious kinds of, back in 22, we start to have kind of vainglorious thoughts or an attitude towards this great feat which we have accomplished, this feat of exile, we should know where that's coming from. And if people praise us for it, we also should know where that's coming from, because our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual powers. And we have to be very, it's one of the difficult things in being lay people and going to a monastery, sometimes in striking up conversations with the monks, is that you can end up praising them or doing something like that, and all it does is leads them into the temptation of pride or vainglory or these other kinds of things, and we have to be very careful about that when we do visit a monastery, because a word of encouragement is one thing, and something that it excites pride is not, or is something entirely different. Because that word of encouragement should probably be coming from that monk's elder, who should know what that person can deal with and what that person can't. So, for example, going out to West Virginia, there's a few monks who are really quite remarkable, absolutely, and we can see that, but we should never tell them that. Now it talks about, ultimately it's not only exile from our own familiar environment, from our families and our friends, and and all the stuff that we've owned and done and all of that. Another thing in the monastery is that according to the best etiquette for visitors in the monastery, you never ask a monk about his past.
So what brought you here?
Yep.
You may
Exactly.
not want to know.
Yeah. Now, some monasteries also have the rule not to speak to visitors for the monks, and the reason is they're trying to avoid these situations where there is, especially the younger monks who are still struggling to get a handle on some of their passions, especially on the pride and the vainglory and the despondency and and the longing for their families and the longing for parents and and from old familiar ways of relating to people and all of that. It's if they're led into those same temptations again, it's tough for them. It makes it hard. So when you visit a monastery, you have to be very mindful of the trials and the temptations that the brothers are facing. Any other reflections on these?
15.
Uh-huh.
That was intense.
Yeah?
Let him be your father who is able and willing to labor with you in bearing the burden of your sins,
Mm-hmm.
and your mother contrition, which can cleanse you from impurity, and your brother, your comrade, who toils and fights by your side, with you in striving towards the heights. Acquire an inseparable wife, the remembrance of death. Let your beloved children be the size of your heart. Make your body your slave, and your friends the holy powers, angels who can help you with the hour of your death, if they become your friends. This is the generation family of those who are the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
That's just intense.
It is intense. Obviously it starts with that when you enter into the monastic life, you're reborn. It's like baptism, you're reborn. So you have a new father, your spiritual father, the abbot of the monastery. I'm speaking in the masculine, or spiritual mother in a women's monastery. And he gives you a name, he clothes you, he becomes your father. And I always thought it kind of funny, especially when the younger monks in the monastery would even call me dad. I was like, oh. Anyway. And your mother, contrition, which can cleanse you from impurity. Don't normally think of mothers in those terms. Your brother, your comrades, the other monks who fight side by side with you in striving towards the heights. And an inseparable wife. Now, of course, these are for celibates, so the remembrance of death. And let your beloved children be the size of your heart. This is serious stuff.
Does it ever come a point where a monk is just joyful with his life? Absolutely.
In fact, one of the contemporary elders, maybe Elder Ephraim, says that it's imperative for a monk during the day in public with the other brothers and all to always be joyful. He can mourn at night during his prayer rule, and that's what that's for. And if you're sad and morose during the day, that means you probably didn't mourn enough at night. But mourning and contrition is a very important part of the spiritual rule. So, and it's nothing forced. It becomes second nature. Now the other thing that's very real are the angels. And it's certainly not the fluffy little fairies that we think about in our culture. It's not what angels are. The heavenly bodiless powers. Now, some of them get depicted in our iconography. It's interesting in Western, especially contemporary Western holy pictures. Basically, you've got all of these. The angels are all feminine and long flowing robes and sweet and gentle and kind of like fairies, only big fairies maybe. Whereas in the Orthodox iconography, the proper Orthodox iconography, they're very strong and masculine and usually have a sword or a spear.
So they look more like soldiers.
So, and they're dressed as often dressed as soldiers.
I guess it'd be Roman uniforms,
Yeah.
because that was the military of the Roman world.
Right. So then there's the modern version of all of that where you've got weightlifters, all dressed up like, So
Bodiless powers, that's pretty strong.
the bodiless powers.
Yes.
But, there's a difference between someone who's strong from weightlifting and someone who's strong from martial training.
Mm-hmm.
The muscles they develop are completely different. So, you can tell when looking at someone if they're trained just to make themselves look strong and someone who's actually trained in martial combat.
Yeah.
The muscles they develop are The one who's trained in martial combat, the look is more lean. But I don't know.
What is true?
Well, like they don't look so big they'd fall over from their weight of their own muscles.
Especially the muscle in between the eyes.
But bodiless powers will only manifest themselves in dreams? Is that?
No. The angels manifest themselves in all sorts of various ways, and eventually one clarifies. With as one progresses spiritually, your spiritual vision becomes greater, more and more acute, and some people can begin to perceive angels and to see angels.
Can
Actually,
an angel be seen, or can it just be?
yeah, it can be seen sometimes.
Okay.
It's spiritually seen, but eventually the spiritual the spiritual transforms even the physical sense of sight, so that one can see the uncreated light of God. One can see angels. One can see demons, and it's not imagination.
Really good. I read an article last night on the catalog of VDs, and I had to look for it. It was about St. Luke, a lot of Greece. It was about his life, and there's a young man, if you haven't heard his life before, there's a young man who was very pious, set apart and whatnot. His father passed away, so he secretly, it says, went to the monastery. And at one time, his abbot came to him and he says, "You must go back home to your mother," because his mom was like reprimanding the abbot in her dreams. Why are you tormenting an old woman? And so he had a vision of his mom tormenting him in dreams. And so basically, he went back. He was obedient. He went back, and then 4 months later, he got his mother's blessing to go to the monastery. So essentially, the article was discussing how important it is for children. I mean, it's commanded by God to honor the father and mother, to be obedient. And so, I think when we're reading this, I think the proper, pious Orthodox parents, of course they'll miss their children and whatnot, but at the end of the day, they don't really belong to us, they belong to God.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's their calling to be a monk, then we would send them off for open arms.
Right. One of the saddest things with some of Elder Ephraim's monasteries is that these kids have gone off to the monasteries, and some not kids. I mean, some. Like there's one case of a woman who went and joined one of the elders' women's monasteries, and she was in her 30s, and her parents sued the monastery and had her kidnapped, as if she wasn't able to make a decision for herself. And there's lawsuits and other stuff, and accusations of being a cult because the kid went off to join the monastery, and so there's all sorts of aspects of this. There are different traditions within monasticism about what is the degree of separation. Now, there are some places where they tell you, just leave, don't tell anyone where you're going or what you're doing. And then after 6 months, you can write to your parents and tell them where you are. Now, I don't agree with that at all. The Russian tradition, and the Greeks are more into that than the Russians. The Russians are, there's this kind of rivalry between the Greek tradition and the Russian tradition. It's kind of fun. But the Russians, they encourage you to keep in contact with your parents. You call once a week or something like, I always did. I always had my monks, especially the younger ones, call once a week. And they can come visit and, visits home. So, because there's an organic kind of community. The way monasticism developed, there's an organic community between the parishes and the monasteries. And, and the families will will send their kids to the monasteries because they know that it's the best life for them. And but in turn, the monasteries will often even care for the parents when they get old. And there's this very close interaction between the families. One of the ladies in Manton, she was the mother of the youngest monk. We had Father Sebastian, who joined us at 18 years old. She created an organization called Moms, Mothers of Monks. And she'd send cookies, a whole bit. So, in some cases, this is interpreted very strictly. In other places, it's not. So,
it's probably different if the overall culture is more of a communal living, so it's not as big of a loss. I would imagine that your child went off to the monastery when you live in a community, and all the children, you don't feel like you're this isolated family of three, and your only child joined the monastery. You don't feel like you've been orphaned.
yeah.
And it must be different, I imagine.
Yeah. It's very interesting to see, how the institution of monasticism has evolved in various places in different contexts. But there still has to be detachment. There still has to be separation. And even if it's more a detachment, not of renunciation of parents and renunciation but rather a reordering of the relationship. That you no longer derive your identity from your parents. That your identity comes from Christ and the monastic life. You no longer derive your identity from your friends and from your possessions and all of that, but only from Christ. And then everything reorders itself that way. So
Is it harder? Because there is a lot of I've read quite a few cases of family members joining together, even husband and wife, like Saint Kudrate Galila. They were married, and I think they were married, and then they decided, but more of like father and son that go on and join a monastery. Is that hard to do?
Is it hard to do? Well,
and your dad is also a monk there.
Well, that's actually not something uncommon. So often brothers will go together, or sisters will go together, parents and children. So St. Gregory Palamas, his father, his parents decided to go into monastic life, and his father was a very high court official. I mean, he was the tutor to the emperor's children, which is like a very exalted kind of position. And so the father took the boys and the mother took the girls and went into separate monasteries. And that still happens. There's a number of instances where people will couples after they've raised their children will go into separate monasteries. So, but it has to be mutual.
How do you, when it talks about how you must detach from your relatives, but if they are also your brethren in the community, in the monastic community, is that a special case, or is just the same? Just you change the relationship to that person?
Well, the relationship changes. In a sense, you become closer brothers
So
in the monastery than you were probably in the world.
You don't have to avoid them.
Right, right. When I was in seminary, there was a little Greek monastery I used to go to down in Astoria, which is Greek town. I think it's kind of gotten overtaken by other ethnicities now, but in the middle of Queens. And it was two brothers, the Markopoulos brothers, fathers Eurytheos and Kyrillos, and they had a brownstone. They took out the second floor and made the first floor of the church, so it went all the way up 2 floors. Then they lived in the basement, and they had a preschool, a kindergarten, in the basement of this brownstone in the middle of a block in Astoria. That was my introduction to Greek village piety, and it was really neat. Because you'd go into the church and it was total Byzantine chaos. You'd have the priest doing one thing and the cantor doing another thing, and the people, making the sign of the cross and prostrating, and and they were singing along. Some of them were in sync with one or the other, and it didn't quite work. But none of them were in sync in doing prostrations. They were all doing it, and it was just chaos. But it was a holy chaos, and the icons would weep myrrh, and they had a whole cabinet full of relics, which they opened it up, and you were just blown away by the fragrance of the myrrh coming out of the relics, and it was just pretty mind blowing. So that's a case where and there are multiple cases on Mount Athos where you have usually pairs of brothers. And sometimes a young guy will go into the monastery, and eventually his father will come. So he loses his wife, and so he comes to the monastery. But there's all sorts of things. There's also a very old tradition of monasteries taking in orphans, or of families giving a child, literally, to the monastery. And now those kids are not permitted to take monastic vows until they've come of age. But they grow up in the monastery. I have one spiritual child. She's the daughter of a priest who grew up in one of Elder Ephraim's monasteries in Pennsylvania from the time she was 12. Then, having grown up in the monastery, it was determined that the abbess determined that she should go get married. So she now has 4 kids, and her husband's a priest. There were a couple of some remarkable elders that I'd met. Father Roman Braga, did you ever hear of him? From Michigan. He and his sister entered the monastery at 11 and 12 years old. Of course, it was wartime in Romania, and it was, but they persevered in the monastic life, and she became an abbess, and he became an elder. Remarkable, and you think about it. If you go into the monastic life at that age, 11 or 12, before puberty, and think of the purity that they have. Never having had to deal with certain kinds of areas of life.
Like the Theotokos and turn.
Yeah, exactly. So
There's a story in the book Everyday Saints, sort of subtitled The Son of a Monk. That's about a man that thought he was doomed because he was the son of a monk. He was the son of a monk that went back into the world, got married, and is that true?
yeah,
He can't be.
he's not doomed, but
No, he's not responsible for his
No.
parents. But if a monk leaves the monastery and goes out and becomes married, is that?
it's a sin. You're excommunicated for a while, at least for a year. And there's another story of this guy who'd been a monk in a monastery, a small schema, The small schema it's a cross on the front, but it's got it's a yoke, and on the back there's a square of material with a cross on all the instruments of the Lord's Passion. It says, I bear on my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. And then there's, you've all seen like the lines on the St. Herman icon going this way and going this way, because it's all connected, and it's a yoke. And so this little boy goes up to his dad, who's laying on the beach, and he says, "Daddy, what's this?" Even though obviously the guy was bare-chested, he could still see. So we take it very seriously. We take monastic renunciation very seriously. And once you've progressed to the level of the schema, it's, you make your vows to God, you make your promises to God. It's nothing man can absolve.
When you think about, now of course, the monastery is a place of prayer, a place of repentance, and for the monks and whatnot. And of course, we will be attracted to the monastery. It's a lighthouse for the faithful or whatnot. To interact with monks, to re-energize and things of this nature. But I always wondered about young men, as they're coming of age or whatnot. Like my boys, for instance, going to the monastery, in particular when they become teenagers, for the summer, like for a month of the summer or something like this, similar to what George did, as they discern their calling in life.
Mm-hmm.
And at the very least, even if they feel that they're called to be married and to whatever,
Right.
do something else, I feel like the lessons that they learn just with regards to their own spirituality will make them better husbands and fathers, etc.
Yeah.
So how do you manage the respect for the monastery, for the brethren, to have, if you will, not peace, but to maintain their life, but still have that interaction that we were talking about earlier?
Well, it's depends on the community. It has to be a large enough community to be able to deal with that.
Okay.
And we used to have a summer novice program where we'd have college boys come. But they were like 18 and up, and we'd work them, but then we had to feed them too. But 35 people for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's a lot of people. And thanks to their labor, the monastery was saved from the fires because they cleared all the dead wood out of the forest. When we were in Point Reyes, we had a interesting situation. Of course, we had 1,400 square feet for 12 people. So literally everybody was on top of one another. And in some friends of the monastery in Sacramento, which has a huge Russian population, a Russian family, they had twin boys that got into twin trouble. They vandalized an elementary school, and they were 13. And so the mother, without informing us, went to plead before the judge, saying, "Can we send them to the monastery instead of to juvie?" And so the judge took one look at the schedule of the monastery, and it was between us and Platina, which is just across the valley from us. They said, "This is far, far stricter than any juvenile hall." And so Platina got one, and we got one. And that kid got he had a private tutor. And so he his academic studies were fantastic. And he ended up graduating high school at 16. The guy at Platina didn't fare quite so well, but he wasn't quite as intellectually gifted as his brother. But both of them were mischievous. So the one who came to us, well, he escaped only with getting a swirly. The younger brothers, after a couple of years, actually, a year and a half, actually, and he was on his way out. So they decided to give him a parting gift. So, and having been good Boy Scouts, they knew about such things. The kid at Platina didn't fare so well. Of course, he didn't get a swirly because they didn't have a toilet. They had an outhouse, and they weren't going to do that to him. But they tied him to a tree for 24 hours.
At least they didn't stake him to an anthill.
What's that?
At least they didn't stake him to an anthill.
Oh, I think they probably would have if they thought about it.
It's an old Apache torture method.
No, this is just so. But it was quite an experience for the monastery to have 13-year-olds around, both monasteries. Luckily, we had a guy who knew how to tutor high school, in junior high school, but Platina didn't. So, but here again, there's no expectation that they would ever necessarily join the community. But it was good that it wasn't to an anthill. Of course, at Platina they had more scorpions than ants.
In recent years, I've noticed there is a trend, at least in Bulgaria, to have summer camp
Mm-hmm.
at the monastery. And I don't think the monastery actually does the camp, but they just open up for parishes to bring kids for summer camp.
They have that.
So they have a summer camp at the monastery,
Mm-hmm.
and some of it is even, it's not a sleep over camp. They go for activity, they go home. But I've noticed that in recent years. I thought it was a great idea. Bring the kids, have the activities there, have a monk or a priest, interact with them, just have all the regular summer camp stuff, but in this shell of community of faith.
St. Nina's up in Maryland does that every summer.
There's several monasteries that do.
Jordanville, I think, does it.
What's that?
I think Jordanville does it.
Oh yeah, they have the summer boys.
So it's a big job up there. I know we get a lot of folks to come help.
Oh yeah.
Everything from cooking to
In Mount Athos, there's a school, a boarding school. And I was shocked. I walked into St. Andrew's Skeet, which is this huge Russian skeet that was built in the 19th century. It's got the largest church on Mount Athos. And there's this kind of broad paved walkway going to the front of the monastery. And I could have sworn that I heard a ball game going on. And so I walked over to the side, and indeed it dropped down about 30 feet to a parking lot. And there were these kids playing soccer. And that's where the school has been relocated to. It was at Vadapeti, and it had its foundations in the 18th century, and so it's been ongoing ever since. But for example, Metropolitan Alexios of Atlanta was a product of that school, the Greek bishop of Atlanta. So, was that a question? No comment? Shall we finish this last little bit? 25.
Concerning dreams that beginners have. It is impossible to hide the fact that our mind, which is the organ of knowledge, is extremely imperfect and full of all kinds of ignorance. The palate distinguishes different foods, the hearing discerns thoughts, the sun reveals the weakness of the eyes, and words betray a soul's ignorance. But the law of love is an incentive to attempt things that are beyond our capacity. And so I think, but I do not dogmatize, that after a chapter on exile, or rather in this very chapter, something should be inserted about dreams, so that we may not be in the dark concerning this trickery of our wily foes. A dream is a movement of the mind while the body is at rest. A fantasy is an illusion of the eyes when the intellect is asleep. A fantasy is an ecstasy of the mind when the body is awake. A fantasy is a vision of something which does not exist in reality. The reason we have decided to speak about dreams here is obvious. When we leave our homes and relatives for the Lord's sake, and sell ourselves into exile for the love of God, then the demons try to disturb us with dreams, representing to us that our relatives are either grieving or dying, or are held captive for our sake and are destitute. But he who believes in dreams is like a person running after his own shadow and trying to catch it. The demons of vainglory prophesy in dreams. Being unscrupulous, they guess the future and foretell it to us. When these visions come true, we are amazed, and we are elated with the thought that we are already near to the gift of knowledge. A demon is often a prophet to those who believe him, but he is always a liar to those who despise him. Being a spirit, he sees what is happening in this lower air, and noticing that someone is dying, he foretells it through dreams to the more light-minded. But the demons know nothing about the future from foreknowledge, for if they did, then the fortune tellers would also be able to foretell our death. Demons often transform themselves into angels of light and take the form of martyrs, and make it appear to us during sleep that we are in communication with them. Then, when we wake up, they plunge us into unholy joy and conceit. But you can detect their deceit by this very fact. For angels reveal torments, judgments, and separations. And when we wake up, we find that we are trembling and sad. As soon as we begin to believe the demons in dreams, then they make sport of us when we are awake too. He who believes in dreams is completely inexperienced. But he who distrusts all dreams is a wise man. Only believe dreams that warn you of torments and judgments. But if despair afflicts you, then such dreams are also from demons. This is the third step, which is equal in number to the Trinity. He who has reached it, let him not look to the right hand nor to the left.
Okay. This is very important. And this not only applies to monks, and actually, not 80% of this book doesn't specifically apply just to the monastic life. These initial chapters do. But in the Orthodox tradition, we do not take dreams seriously. Very important. We don't look for their meaning. We don't write them down. We don't do anything with them.
Or visions.
Or visions.
Fantasies.
Fantasies.
Don't think much of Freud.
Pardon?
Don't think much of Freud.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like
No, we don't think of Freud. He was an apostate Jew, who was obsessed with sex.
Right.
There's some good things, but I love this line. He who believes in dreams is like a person running after his own shadow and trying to catch it.
So a person running away from the light?
Yeah, if you run after your dreams, you're running away from the light.
Well, if you're running after your own shadow, that means you're facing the exact opposite direction of the light. 'Cause you're-
That's right.
Light, you know, if you're obstructing the light and you're casting a shadow in front of you or chasing it, and it's always if you turn to the light, right or left, you're not going to be chasing your shadow. You're going to be chasing to the left or right of your shadow. So you keep it's the polar opposite of what you should be doing.
Yeah.
I had a hard time reading that first paragraph with that laugh.
Yeah. So 26. A dream is a movement of the mind while the body is at rest. But then it gets a little more interesting. A fantasy is an illusion of the eyes when the intellect, in other words, the nous, is asleep. In other words, there's nothing spiritual about it.
Like watching TV.
Yeah, essentially. TV kind of incarnates fantasy.
It just seems to be such a condemnation of the current charismatic scenes where
They're into dreams.
Oh, yeah.
into dreams and then into intuitions and into all of that,
The Lord told me.
fantasies.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's one of the things about the Orthodox tradition. It's stone cold sober. And if you want to see sobriety incarnate, read Saint Ignatiy Bryanchaninov. It's really sober. It's really no dreams, no visions, no images, no nothing. You read your prayers and you do your prostrations and you do your work and that's it, basically.
Now, I understand that, but at the same time, let's say for example, St. Patrick.
Mm-hmm.
His whole ministry, I mean, his whole calling was in a dream. He first he escaped slavery because of a dream,
Mm-hmm.
and then he went back to Ireland because of a dream.
Right, and there is a qualification in Saint Ignatiy Bryanchaninov, because for the most part he says that even if God is trying to catch our attention in a dream, and we ignore it, fearing delusion, it's fine with God. God understands. But there are times, and this takes great spiritual discernment, and discernment that you submit to an elder. If there is some kind of a calling or revelation in a dream, and you don't you don't believe it until you've brought it to the elder, and he says, yes, this is real, or no, this is your own fantasy, and get over yourself. You know. But because there are many stories of people who have callings and through dreams and through visions and things like that. But and the criterion of that, it's not dealt with in here, is that if something, he talks about if it's an angelic experience, if it's an angelic or divine calling, it leaves you in a state of contrition. But if it's demonic, it'll either leave you in a state of pride and conceit, or it'll leave you profoundly disturbed. And the way that you discern a demonic experience from a divine experience is that the demonic experience leaves a darkness and a profound heaviness on the soul, and an encounter with the divine leaves you prostrated before God with a sense of the most radical unworthiness, or it leaves you in absolute awestruck, in absolute awe absolutely stricken with awe that you can't even.
It says the same thing here, just does it very briefly.
Right.
Because only believe dreams that warn you of torments and judgments. But if despair afflicts you, then such dreams are also from demons.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Francis of Assisi had dreams and visions, but it was all delusion
Not all of it was delusion.
for the most part.
Maybe.
He equated himself with Christ.
Whether he did or whether his biographers did. I have great sympathy with Saint Francis of Assisi. I have no problem with his canonization. And one of the big difficulties with hagiography is that it's an icon. Hagiography is a verbal icon, and very often hagiography goes way off into all sorts of hyperbole, and so so my guess is that Francis himself would never have identified himself with Christ, but his followers, and so. And you find the same thing in our hagiography too. Some of it goes way off, but not as much. So a lot of the Western hagiography, they kind of lost limits. They lost their limits in the Middle Ages, and so they went way overboard on certain kinds of pieties and all sorts of stuff. And the Reformation went threw the baby out with the bathwater, trying to bring it back. But essentially, when the West left the accountability of the whole church, which is what happened when it left Orthodoxy. It lost sobriety. Just to conclude it, sobriety is the whole point. And if there is some kind of sense of calling, you always take it to a spiritual father, and let him make the discernment, not you. And you accept his discernment and be obedient to it. And if he tells you that it's your own ego and your own fantasy, then believe him. So, okay.